1975 was the year when the United States finally pulled out of South Vietnam. Helicopters clattered onto the roof of its embassy to take out the last officials. Once they were safely aboard the waiting carriers, the helicopters were ditched to make room for more. The Viet Cong drove in triumph into Saigon. President Ford had little to say to pursuing newsmen, while his predecessor's discredited aides tried to put a brave face on their prison sentences.
Been a lot worse. He might have sentenced me to live with Martha Mitchell, so I think I'm on a plus side since then.
Jimmy Hoffa, fighting to get his old job back as president of the Teamsters Union, was still America's most charismatic labor leader. On the 30th of July, 1975, he set off to lunch at this restaurant near Detroit. He was spotted leaving in a car. Then he went missing, and no trace of him was ever seen again. There was a nationwide search, all in vain. His disappearance remains a mystery. Controversial and corrupt, gutsy and abrasive, 62-year-old Hoffa had made a lot of enemies as president of the Teamsters. Born in Brazil, Indiana in 1913, he was left fatherless at 7. He quit school early to help support his mother and brothers. He got a job unloading food and joined the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, chauffeurs, warehousemen, and helpers. By 18, he had been elected a local official. He called a strike just when a load of strawberries had to be moved into cold store. Management caved in immediately. Hoffa had discovered his vocation, union organizer. He proved a fearless recruiter and negotiator. The 30s were a rough time for labor relations in the United States. Organizers were killed, cars were bombed, and strikes often turned violent. Hoffa's brother was among the victims of a shooting that occurred during one of these strikes. Troops were sometimes called in, and management and unions used the mafia to intimidate each other. Hoffa threatened to move his members into the rackets. Then he proposed a deal. The Teamsters wouldn't get into crime if the mob wouldn't interfere with his Teamsters. The mob agreed and gave a rake-off on the extra profits that resulted. Jimmy Hoffa had found his formula. Cash and connections for him, jobs and security for the members of Detroit Local 299. He married an 18-year-old girl, Josephine Pochivak. He met when they picketed the laundry she worked in. They soon had a daughter, then a son. He worked long and hard for his members and to develop his own power base. Soon his talents were nationally recognized. The gutsy 5'5" organizer was sent to help members wherever a tough, no-holds-barred approach was needed. In 1942, exempt from military service because his union work was considered vital to the nation, Hoffa created a unified Michigan Conference of Teamsters. As the Second World War ended, Hoffa was re-elected president of Local 299. The massive economic surge which the United States experienced after the war gave the Teamsters an immensely powerful position, and Hoffa became chief negotiator of all Teamsters in the central United States. By 1956, he was in a position of national power and was being courted by businessmen and politicians at home and abroad. In Israel, he met Prime Minister Golda Meir and personally donated large sums to found a children's home. His house in a Detroit backstreet, bought for $6,800 in 1939, was just a place to sleep. Working a 20-hour day, he had reached the number 2 spot in the Teamsters and was heir apparent to the aging Dave Beck, nominal president of the union. But it was Hoffa who controlled the members and the money. But links with the mob landed him in 1957 in front of the Senate Select Committee on Improper Labor and Management Activities. Robert Kennedy, the McLennan Committee's chief counsel, now declared a lifelong vendetta against Hoffa.
You breathe the same thing, Mr. Hoffa. Wait a minute. Or otherwise you wouldn't have said don't...
On television, he attacked a union official, often supported by his brother, the future president, who was on the committee and sat beside him.
While leaving the hearings, after these people had testified regarding this matter, did you say that SOB, I'll break his back?
Who?
You.
Say to who?
To anyone. Did you make that statement after these people testified before the committee?
I never talked to either one of them after testifying.
No, I'm not talking about to them. Did you make that statement here in the hearing room after the testimony was finished?
Not concerning them, far as I know of.
Well, who did you make it about?
I don't know. I may have been discussing somebody in a figure of speech.
Well, who did you make the statement? Whose back were you going to break?
I don't even remember it.
Well, whose back were you going to break, Mr. Hoffa?
Figure of speech, I don't even know who I was talking about, and I don't know what you're talking about.
Kennedy grilled Hoffa 18 times and attempted to jail him for planting a stooge inside the committee staff. Kennedy was appalled by the evidence which emerged of links between the Teamsters and the Mafia. He had earlier gone after Dave Beck, going into great detail to prove his links with organized crime. As a result, in March 1957, Beck was convicted of grand larceny for income tax evasion, false tax returns, and misuse of union funds. But Jimmy Hoffa was harder to pin down. The jury at his trial just couldn't agree, and he went free. So, with Beck discredited and fighting to stay out of jail, Hoffa made his move to win the #1 spot. That year, 1957, he stood for president of the union and was the popular favorite. The members felt that, however dubious his connections, he had their interests at heart and that he was a tireless and successful negotiator for them. He walked away with the presidency, winning 1,208 votes against 453 for his combined opponents. But immediately there were problems. A court order restrained Hoffa from taking office until questions raised by the McLennan Committee had been answered. Then the AFL-CIO, the National Federation of Labor Unions, decided that the racketeering charges against the Teamsters were bringing the rest of the movement into discredit.
I can say to you that in the 4 years since our last...
The Federation's president, George Meany, led the drive to oust the Teamsters, and at its national conference in December 1957, well over 2/3 of the delegates voted to expel the Teamsters. Hoffa shrugged off the news, saying, "The AFL-CIO didn't build us, and they won't weaken us." He plunged into a flurry of activity and pushed through the first national freight haulage agreement. The Teamsters became the largest labor union in America, partly by poaching other unions' members. These either didn't know or didn't care that not all Hoffa's methods were legal. Among the union's more dubious activities were extorting money from companies by threatening strikes or even bodily harm and bribing government officials. Hoffa also got an infamous mafia chief, Anthony Provenzano, known as Tony Pro, made head of New Jersey's 14,000 Teamsters. Sadly, Tony's union work in Hoboken was interrupted by a 7-year sentence for extortion. It was just one example of the way in which the Teamsters and the Mafia had become intertwined at local level. The massive growth of the Teamsters during the 1950s gave Hoffa control of a ballooning fund of union dues and pension contributions. Not for him the banks or traditional investments. He poured the money into potentially much more lucrative real estate investments in Las Vegas and Florida, projects which were firmly controlled by members of the Mafia. Many of the decisions were made by Hoffa alone, and few other officials in the Teamsters had the authority or knowledge to question him. In all, more than $50 million of Teamster money was siphoned into the crime syndicate's boomtown. Kickbacks and secret loans became commonplace, and many of these were never repaid. But by 1960, these activities had raised so many questions that Hoffa was spending much of his time going to court to answer charges arising from what he regarded as Robert Kennedy's vendetta. he was using nearly 100 lawyers, all paid for by the union. In 1962, Hoffa exploited his re-election as president of Local 299 to show how solidly his members were behind him. For the first time since 1937, he faced a challenge. Every weekend he flew back from whatever part of the country his duties as union president had taken him to campaign for his seat.
If we had 3 or 4 more Hoffas in this country, that would be all we need.
There was little doubt that he enjoyed both the backing and friendship of many of his members. He had always made a point of being accessible to them, and now they returned his trust.
Hey, Jimmy, when you get through their head, give it to me. I think I could use it on myself. Don't worry about that.
Right. Bobby Kennedy won't win this election. Don't worry about it. We're going to win it, and that's all there is to it.
For most of them, he was the leader who had vastly improved their pay and working conditions, and they were not too worried about how he had achieved this as they went to the polling booths.
Well, I'll tell you this, it's the most democratic election I've ever seen. Thanks, Jack, thanks.
Outside observers confirmed that the election was run totally honestly, and Hoffa won by 3,615 votes to 208.
Kennedys aren't going to make a football out of this Teamsters Union, not while we're around. I guarantee it. Well, I tell you, Bobby Kennedy's over here running in proxy, you see. Did you say Bobby Kennedy was here by proxy, or he's a doxy? He's worse than that. He's a touch football player.
But the football player, now Attorney General, was still on his trail. First came a charge for assault by a disgruntled Teamster aide. Then it looked like a touchdown when Kennedy put his quarry on trial for widespread bribery with union funds. The defense carted filing cabinets into court to counter each charge as it came up. Hoffa was unrepentant and confident.
And since we don't know which witness or which loan is going to be discussed during the course of the day, we're forced to bring to the courtroom all of our files to be in a position, irrespective of what witness or what loan, we can immediately reach in the file and have access to the information to defend ourselves.
Despite the troubles of their president, outside the courtroom the Teamsters flourished. The membership was largely divided between those who didn't believe the charges and those who didn't care. In the event, the government decided not to proceed with the assault charges, and the bribery case collapsed with a hung jury. The greatest threat to Hoffa came when a former mental patient tried to shoot him in court with an air pistol. But this good luck did not last. The government brought new charges that Hoffa had bribed jury members to ensure that the trial would collapse. It then charged him again with diverting huge sums of money from the union's pension funds. Hoffa fought back.
I have an affidavit in my possession signed by a former employee working for Walter Sheridan who returned works for the Justice Department, Bobby Kennedy, to where he states emphatically they will never rest until they put Hoffa in jail, even if they have to trump up charges.
Do you think they're going to put Hoffa in jail as a result of this trial?
Not if I get a fair trial, and I have not received a fair trial here. The government deliberately hid evidence. The government deliberately used the court to hide evidence. And the government has deliberately lied under oath.
But these assertions failed to impress. In March 1964, Hoffa was found guilty of jury tampering. He received an 8-year sentence. Then in July, he was found guilty of the conspiracy and fraud charges as well. His sentence, a further 5 years in jail. Hoffa vowed to fight on and attacked his old and bitter enemy.
I have been sentenced. I will appeal. I am not guilty. And I say to the millions of members of organized labor, have heed, because those who fight for you and fight to win will find that out of this conviction, the zeal of Attorney General Robert Kennedy will be to destroy you unless you give in.
He walked off to begin his struggle to stay out of prison. He stayed on as president of the union, appointing his friend Frank Fitzsimmons vice president on the understanding that if imprisoned, he would take over again when released. Over the next 2.5 years, Hoffa and his attorneys fought to keep him free. They accused the government of unconstitutional activities such as unauthorized wiretapping and the use of perjured witnesses, and they claimed that the charges had been trumped up as a result of the personal vendetta between Hoffa and Robert Kennedy. But in December 1966, Hoffa's last appeal failed, and his convictions were upheld. On the 7th of March 1967, journalists mobbed the president of the Teamsters Union as he reported to the U.S. courthouse in Washington. Jimmy Hoffa was going to jail. It was a day he had thought he would never see. Now, with the handcuffs on his wrists covered by his raincoat, he entered Lewisburg jail, swearing that he would never have to serve his full sentence of 13 years. Shortly before this, at a lavish dinner in his honor, one of the speakers had compared him to Jesus on the cross, with Bobby Kennedy on one side and informers from the Teamsters on the other. The years behind the grim walls were to prove bitter and humiliating. Once inside, he found that he was not getting any special privileges. But much of the membership stayed loyal, and a Teamsters local sent an airplane greeting on every Valentine's Day, his birthday. He remained the nominal president for the first 4 years, but Frank Fitzsimmons soon stopped paying much attention to orders coming from Lewisburg. The hand-picked stooge found that he enjoyed his new power and started looking for ways to make his temporary job permanent. While Hoffa's attempts to get parole were turned down, Fitzsimmons was strengthening his links with President Nixon, who was grateful for the support of a man with 2 million voting members and substantial funds. Nixon told Charles Colson, his presidential assistant, to do anything he could to be helpful. Colson and H.R. Haldeman discussed Hoffa's release on terms favorable to Fitzsimmons. They told junior counsel John Dean to draw up a document commuting Hoffa's sentence in such a way that Fitzsimmons could not be challenged by him. First, Hoffa resigned the Union presidency. Then they wrote in a condition, which he didn't know about, that he couldn't take any further part in Union affairs until 1980. On the 24th of December 1971, President Nixon commuted James Hoffa's sentence. After 4 years and 10 months, Hoffa was a free man. He seemed genuinely ignorant of any limitations.
Were there any prohibitions placed upon your activity as far as getting back into labor management is concerned?
I won't know that until I'm in Detroit on Monday and talk to the parole officer, who one of the rules of the release from the prison will outline the conditions that I'll work under. I don't know.
What do you think?
He was also tactful about the abilities of his supposedly temporary successor.
Internationally, are you satisfied now that the Union is in good hands, in the hands of Mr. Fitzsimmons?
Frank Fitzsimmons and I have been friends for over 40 years. Frank came off the truck when I first hired him. As I come out of a warehouse, he's an excellent administrator, knows the insides and out of the Teamsters Union just as well as I do, and has done an excellent job, and I'm sure he'll continue to do so.
This cloud of goodwill was blown away when Jimmy Hoffa discovered that he'd been legally castrated. Fitzsimmons and the White House had made sure he would never work in the Union again. He seemed totally amazed.
Not until I was on the street and in St. Louis, Missouri, several hours later, did I know there was a 1980 restriction.
Back at home at his lakeside cottage, he discovered that it wasn't only the White House which preferred Fitzsimmons. The mob had found Fitz much easier to control, and Hoffa started making veiled threats in his constant phone calls to former colleagues as to what he might reveal in order to get reinstated. Meanwhile, Fitzsimmons was safeguarding his own position by donating $1 million to Nixon's re-election fund. Hoffa's attempts to force the White House to publish the confidential documents relating to his release failed. So did his attempt to have the presidential limitation on his activities ruled unconstitutional. There was a rash of violent incidents. The car of Frank Fitzsimmons' son was blown up, and supporters on both sides were physically attacked. Hoffa had also lost the friendship of Tony Provenzano by failing to back him in a pension scam. He was now a sworn enemy and dedicated to stopping Hoffa getting back into the Union. So it was foolhardy of Hoffa to agree to go to a meeting at the Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, 15 miles northwest of Detroit. This was apparently with Provenzano or some of his mafia colleagues to discuss making peace. Hoffa's last known movements were described by his son, James P. Hoffa.
He left for an appointment at Max's Red Fox restaurant at approximately 1:30 p.m. Wednesday, July 30, 1975. He called home at approximately 2:15 p.m. We have not heard from him since.
Hoffa had called in on his way to the Red Fox at a limousine company. There he mentioned that he was meeting Tony Provenzano and a colleague. He was seen waiting in the car park, looking angry. In his call to his wife, he said that he had been stood up. The last sighting of him was driving off in a car with 3 men. A nationwide search followed, with hundreds of leads and reported sightings being followed up, but nothing was found. The FBI became involved in the case on the 3rd of August because kidnap demands were received. All of these proved false. James P. Hoffa indicated one possible cause for his father's disappearance.
Well, it's difficult to imagine anybody having a motive to harm my father or abduct him, and I would think that there must be some relationship back to the Union, although I cannot name names, and I really don't know names.
One name he may have had in mind was Charles O'Brien, Hoffa's foster son. Chucky, as he was always known, had been brought into the Teamsters by Hoffa, but had defected to Frank Fitzsimmons. He disappeared on the 1st of August, and his Union colleagues seemed perplexed by his behavior.
In my mind,
is it normal for a man not to show up to work and not call his boss?
If you know Mr. O'Brien, most anything is normal.
But when O'Brien reappeared after 5 days, he had a perfectly clear explanation. He had gone to Memphis to spend time with his new bride, and then on to Washington for a business meeting with Frank Fitzsimmons. He seemed equally perplexed when interviewed later.
Something to hide. I came back because I came down here to visit my family, and I get a phone call saying that I'm missing. And ironically, it was blown into a proportion that I immediately came back to Detroit and made myself available to anybody that is involved in the case that want to talk to me.
Tony Provenzano and his mafia associates were interviewed, but all had formidable alibis. For the FBI, the Hoffa case is still officially open, but their belief is that he never left the car he was seen driving off in alive. One theory has it that the 3 men were mafia executioners who shot or garroted him as they drove along. His body was supposedly stuffed into an oil drum and buried deep in a dump that had served as a mafia cemetery before. Since his disappearance and assumed murder, Jimmy Hoffa has been recognized as a brilliant labor leader whose links with crime were the downside of a ruthless dedication to his members.
And my philosophy is very simple. The working man of America is being shortchanged every day in America. And I spent all of my life getting conditions, wages, and hours for workers in this country. And I stand on my record then and now.
Like Faust, he made a pact with the devil. Like Faust, he paid the penalty.